Thank you, Jennifer, so much for coming in today. So if you could start by introducing yourself and telling us about your connection to the land.
Yes, sure. So it's Jennifer David and Tissanakasin. I am of mixed ancestry, which includes Anishinaabe and what we call Innu. Some people might use the word Cree. I'm from a region we call Omashkego or Mushkegowuk territory, which is Treaty 9 territory, northeastern Ontario, and I belong to the Chapleau Cree First Nation. And so I always shout out those ancestral lands where I come from.
So if you could start by telling us about NVision and the path.
Sure. So I am a senior consultant at NVision Insight Group, and I've been a consultant for, almost 25 years now. But prior to that, I left Northern Ontario to come to Ottawa, where I got a journalism degree at Carleton University. And then I used to be the director of communications at the Aboriginal People's TV network. And then I got into my own consulting, and then I joined a company which then morphed into what's now NVision Insight Group. And so probably I've been doing Indigenous cultural awareness for, about 15 years. And it started out as an in-person workshop. And then the TRC issued their calls to action for education. And so from there, we built an online Indigenous cultural awareness course. And then when COVID hit, we moved and adapted our in-person workshop into a virtual facilitated workshop. And so now this course we have is called The Path, Your Journey Through Indigenous Canada. And the reason why we call it The Path is something that Senator Murray Sinclair, retired Senator Murray Sinclair, when he was chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when they issued their report and their calls to action, he said to people, "We have described for you a mountain. We have shown you the path to the top. We call on you to do the climbing." And that's how I always describe cultural awareness. It's really that first baby step in climbing that mountain, and that I like to consider myself a guide for people on this path as they do that climbing.
What can participants expect to learn about the history and lived experiences of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people by taking the path?
So I'll talk about a few things. One, I don't know if people know, but the Indian Act, when it came into being in 1876, purposefully discriminated against women. You could not get Indian status if you were a woman that belonged to an Indian band. You could only get that if you were a man or a child of a man or married to a man. So that was done intentionally because it disrupted and dismantled matriarchal systems where women had a lot of control and women had a lot of opportunity and leadership. And the federal government in its colonial policies wanted to get rid of that. And they instead wanted to introduce a very patriarchal system that would be consistent across Canada. And so that caused devastation in Indigenous families. Another area where they'll learn about Indigenous women is we talk about the importance of women in the fur trade. We all learned about the fur trade in high school, but we don't remember and we're not taught about how women were pivotal to the fur trade. First Nations women, Métis women, because of course they knew how to paddle the canoes, and they often accompanied these men who were the fur traders, and they knew how to survive in the winter. They knew how to get food. They knew the plants, the animals, the lakes, the land. They knew the medicines. They could make clothing, and yet they're often forgotten as part of their role in the fur trade. So the other thing that's shocking to people is the treatment of women, and we have an epidemic, missing and murdered Indigenous women, but it didn't just spring up out of nowhere. We have to look at the policies that Canada introduced over the centuries, things like forced sterilization, things like that still exist in some places, birth alerts, where First Nations women going into hospitals, sometimes when they go in, the hospitals will alert social services, and when that woman delivers their baby, the baby's taken away from them, often just because they are First Nations. I mean, how is this possible? But we have to highlight that these realities exist, and that in the path we talk about that we reap what we sow. If Canada is going to sow these policies and laws of genocide and discrimination, assimilation, why are we surprised that what we're going to reap from that are these startling, horrible statistics about Indigenous people, about Indigenous women? And I think it's important for us to understand and not just look at the symptoms today, but how did we get, and what are the connections from the past to the present?
March 8th marks International Women's Day. Considering the disproportionate rates of violence, incarceration, and poverty facing Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, what does this day represent for you?
I fully acknowledge the issues, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, and things that Indigenous women have experienced, but I also choose to celebrate the Indigenous and non-Indigenous women in my life. And I think about my great grandmother who's listed on the Treaty 9 pay list, but she's not listed with her own name. She's listed as Mrs. George Swanson. So we have to remember that women and Indigenous women really lost their Indian status, like my great grandmother. But I also think about, my grandmother and her resilience, and she was really the matriarch of our family. And I think of my mothers and my aunts and my girlfriends and all the women that are really trying to make a difference. And so I want to celebrate all of them in all their glory, because as one of us rises, we all rise. And so it's important to celebrate that. The fact that we need to still celebrate or have an International Women's Day tells us that there's still work to do and a ways to go. But that, once we see, again, women rising and taking their sort of rightful place, then we'll start to see, more changes. And we are seeing some, but again, there's still work to do.